The rancher saved the young Apache. The chief roared, "Take 400 cattle and marry my daughter." The land stretched wide and open under a burning sun, quiet in a way that made a man feel small. Dry grass bent with the wind, and the earth cracked where rain had forgotten to fall. This was ranch country, a place where a man survived only by working hard, keeping his word, and minding his own business. The rancher had lived here for years, long enough to know that the land did not forgive mistakes. He rose before the sun each day, checked his cattle, fixed broken fences, and trusted routine more than hope. He was not a cruel man, but he was careful. Life on the frontier had taught him that kindness could sometimes bring danger. Stories traveled fast across the plains, stories of clashes, misunderstandings, and bloodshed between settlers and the Apache people. Some stories were true, some were fear made louder by distance. Still, most ranchers followed one rule above all others: stay out of tribal matters and trouble would pass you by. That afternoon, the sun stood high and unforgiving. The rancher rode along the far edge of his land, checking a fence line that often gave way after storms. His horse slowed near a dry creek bed, snorting and shifting uneasily. Animals sense things before men did. At first, the rancher thought it was a fallen log or a shadow playing tricks on his eyes. Then he saw movement, slow, weak, almost gone. A young man lay half hidden among rocks and dust. His clothes were torn, his skin burned by sun and pain. One leg was badly injured, swollen and dark, and dried blood marked where he had tried to crawl before his strength gave out. The rancher dismounted slowly, his hand tight on the reins. His heart began to beat harder, not from anger but from fear mixed with something else he did not want to name. The young man was Apache. There was no mistaking it. His face, his hair, the small details of how he wore what little he had left, all of it told the truth. The rancher stood there for a long moment, the wind pushing against his coat, the silence pressing in on him. Helping this man could cost him everything. If other settlers found out, they might turn against him. If the Apache came looking, they might not listen before judging. The rancher looked down at the injured man's face. The young man's eyes fluttered open for a moment, filled with pain and confusion. There was no threat in them, only fear and the fading will to survive. He was barely more than a boy. The rancher stepped back, wrestling with himself. He could ride away. No one would know. The land would take the young man as it had taken many others. Out here, death came quietly and often. It would not be the rancher's fault. But as he turned, something stopped him. Maybe it was the memory of his own youth, when he had crossed these plains with nothing but hope and stubborn strength. Maybe it was the simple truth that leaving someone to die felt like crossing a line he could never uncross. He cursed under his breath, not in anger but in surrender. Carefully, he knelt beside the young Apache. The man was burning with fever. The wound on his leg was worse than it first appeared, infected and angry. The rancher tore a strip from his own shirt, poured water from his canteen, and cleaned what he could. The young man groaned softly but did not fight. Trust, even in pain, was already there. Getting him back to the ranch was not easy. The rancher fashioned a rough support, lifting the young man onto his horse with slow, careful movements. Every sound made him tense, his eyes scanning the horizon. At any moment, riders could appear, friends or enemies. He did not know which would be worse. The ranch sat low against the land, a modest house with a weathered barn and a few outbuildings. The rancher did not take the young man inside. Instead, he hid him in the far corner of the barn, behind stacked hay bales where shadows stayed thick. He cleaned the wound again, using what little medicine he had saved for emergencies. He fed the young man small amounts of water, then broth later when the fever eased. Night fell slowly, painting the sky in deep reds and fading gold. The rancher barely slept. Every sound, a coyote's call, the creak of wood, the wind against the door, pulled him awake. He knew that if anyone discovered what he had done, explanations would not come easily. Over the next few days, the rancher lived two lives. In front of his workers, he acted as he always had, firm and quiet, giving instructions, fixing problems, counting cattle. In secret, he returned again and again to the barn, tending to the injured Apache. The young man spoke little, his strength coming back in pieces. When he did speak, it was mostly thanks, whispered and sincere. The rancher did not ask questions. He did not want to know how the young man had been hurt or why he had been alone. Some truths carried weight, and the rancher already felt heavy enough. He focused on what he could control: clean bandages, steady food, and rest. On the fourth day, the fever broke. The young man sat up for the first time, leaning against the wall, eyes clearer now. He looked at the rancher with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Slowly, with effort, he placed his hand over his heart and spoke his name. The rancher nodded but did not offer his own. Names had power, and this situation already had too much of it. Outside, rumors began to move like dust in the wind. Someone had seen Apache riders far to the east. Another claimed cattle tracks led somewhere unexpected. The rancher listened but said nothing. Each night he wondered if he had made a mistake that would cost lives, including his own. Yet, despite the fear, something steady grew inside him. Watching the young man regain strength reminded him why he had chosen this life in the first place, not just for land or profit, but for the freedom to live by his own rules. And one of those rules, buried deep but unbroken, was that a man did not turn away from another human being in need. One morning, as the sun rose pale and quiet, the young Apache stood on his own, leaning only slightly. He looked toward the open land, toward home. The rancher knew this moment was coming, and it filled him with dread. Once the young man left, the secret would no longer belong only to him. The rancher handed him food, water, and a blanket. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then the young man spoke, his voice steady now. He said the debt between them would not be forgotten. Among his people, a life saved was not something that faded with time. The rancher waved the words away, uncomfortable. He had not done this for reward or recognition. He had done it because he could not live with the other choice. Still, as the young man walked slowly toward the horizon, supported by a borrowed horse, the rancher felt a strange tightening in his chest. The land returned to its quiet rhythm. Cattle grazed, wind moved the grass. But something had changed, even if the rancher did not yet understand how deep that change would run. Mercy had crossed the plains that day, and it did not travel alone. The days after the young man left were uneasy ones. The rancher tried to return to his normal routine, but the land felt different now, as if it were holding its breath. Every sound carried farther than before. Every shape on the horizon made his eyes narrow. He kept working because work was the only thing that kept his thoughts from circling back to that moment by the creek bed. At dawn, he checked the cattle, counting them twice without realizing it. By midday, he repaired a gate that had not truly needed fixing. His hands stayed busy, but his mind wandered. He wondered if the young man had reached his people safely. He wondered if someone would come asking questions. Most of all, he wondered if Mercy would demand a price. Word traveled quickly on the frontier. A neighbor stopped by under the excuse of borrowing tools. He mentioned seeing unfamiliar tracks near the eastern ridge. Another rider spoke of distant campfires at night, small and careful, like eyes watching from the dark. The rancher listened, nodded, and offered no opinions. He had learned long ago that silence was safer than guessing. The workers noticed his tension. One of them asked if trouble was coming. The rancher answered honestly, which was to say he answered very little. He told them to stay alert, to keep close to the ranch, and to avoid wandering alone. Fear spread easily, but he did not want panic. Panic made men foolish. On the third morning, the wind changed. It came from the east, dry and sharp, carrying the smell of dust and smoke. The rancher stood on his porch and felt it brush against his face like a warning. His horse stamped the ground, uneasy again, just as it had been days earlier by the creek. Not long after, a rider appeared on the horizon. Then another. Then more, moving in a wide line, not rushing, not hiding. This was not a raid, this was something else. The rancher felt his chest tighten, but he forced himself to stand still. Running would mean guilt, hiding would mean fear. He chose neither. As the riders drew closer, he saw their dress, their posture, the way they moved as one. These were Apache, and they rode with purpose. His workers gathered behind him, some gripping tools like weapons, others simply frozen. The rancher raised one hand, signaling them to stay back. Whatever was coming, it was his to face. The riders stopped at a respectful distance. From among them came an older man, tall even in age, his presence heavy and calm. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply looked at the rancher with eyes that seemed to measure more than land or cattle. This was the chief. The rancher stepped forward alone. The space between them felt like a line drawn across two worlds. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind moved through the grass and the cattle shifted, sensing the weight of the silence. Then another figure stepped out from the group. The rancher recognized him instantly. The young man stood straighter now, his wound still stiff but healing. His eyes were clear, and when they met the rancher's, something like relief crossed his face. He spoke to the chief in a low voice, words the rancher could not understand, but the meaning was clear enough. The chief listened without interruption. When the young man finished, the chief turned his gaze back to the rancher. The silence stretched again, deep and heavy. The rancher could feel the eyes of both groups on him, waiting. At last the chief spoke. His voice was steady, not loud, but it carried. He asked, through a translator who stepped forward quietly, if it was true that the rancher had saved the young man's life. The rancher did not try to soften the truth. He said yes. He said he found the young man injured and could not leave him to die. The chief nodded once. He asked why the rancher had done this, knowing the risk. The rancher hesitated. There was no answer that would fully explain it. Finally, he said simply that a life was a life, and the land had already taken enough. The words seemed to settle into the ground between them. The chief's expression did not change, but something shifted in the air. He spoke again, slowly this time. He said that among the Apache, saving a life created a bond. It was not a small thing. It could not be ignored or repaid lightly. The rancher felt his throat tighten. He had not helped the young man for reward. The idea of being owed something by an entire people made him uneasy. He said he expected nothing. He only wanted peace. The chief studied him carefully. Then he gave a short command. The riders moved, bringing forward several cattle from behind a low rise. The rancher's breath caught. They were fine animals, healthy and strong. A gift, clearly, but the number was already more than he could easily accept. The chief spoke again, explaining that this was only a sign, not the full measure of the debt. The young man's life had value, and the rancher's courage had crossed a boundary that many feared. This act would be answered in a way that honored both sides. The rancher felt the weight of every word. His workers shifted behind him, whispering in disbelief. Cattle were wealth. Cattle were survival. To give them freely was no small thing. Before the rancher could respond, distant riders appeared again on the horizon, this time settlers drawn by rumor and fear. The rancher saw trouble forming, like a storm building from two directions. He raised his voice, asking the chief to wait. He explained that more people coming would not understand. Fear would twist the truth. The chief considered this. Then he gave another order. His riders held their position, calm and unmoving. When the settlers arrived, tense and ready for the worst, they found no chaos. Only two groups standing apart, neither advancing, neither threatening. The rancher stepped between them. He spoke plainly, telling the settlers that no harm was coming, that there was no attack. Some did not believe him at first. Old fears die hard. But the calm presence of the Apache riders and the absence of drawn weapons slowly eased the tension. The chief watched all of this closely. He saw the rancher stand firm not just for himself, but for peace. When the settlers finally withdrew, uneasy but unharmed, the chief nodded again. This time there was approval in the gesture. As the sun dipped lower, the chief announced that he would return soon to settle the debt properly. This meeting was only the beginning. The rancher tried to object, to say that what he had done required no repayment. The chief stopped him with a raised hand. Some things, he said, were larger than one man's wishes. Honor demanded an answer. Balance demanded it too. With that, the Apache riders turned and rode away, moving as quietly as they had come. The young man looked back once, lifting his hand in farewell. The rancher returned the gesture, his heart heavy with questions. When the dust finally settled, the rancher stood alone in the fading light. The cattle grazed nearby, unaware that their numbers might soon change. The land seemed vast again, but no longer empty. He understood now that the choice he made by the creek had traveled far beyond that moment. It had reached into another world, another way of life, and pulled something loose that could not be undone. That night, as stars filled the sky, the rancher lay awake, listening to the wind. He did not know what the chief would demand. He did not know what the future would bring. But he knew one thing with certainty. The debt of a saved life was coming back across the plains, and it would not arrive quietly. The days that followed felt longer than usual. The rancher moved through them with a steady face, but inside his thoughts were restless. Every sunrise brought the same question. When would the Apache chief return, and what would he ask? The land stayed calm, yet the calm felt like the pause before something heavy settled into place. He tried to prepare for every possibility. He checked his cattle again and again, counting them, noting which were strongest and which were newly born. He repaired fences with extra care, as if strong wood and tight wire could somehow protect him from what was coming. At night he sat on the porch, watching the dark stretch out, listening to the distant sounds of the plains. The workers spoke in low voices now. They respected the rancher, but fear had its own language. Some worried about losing cattle. Others feared anger from nearby settlers if the Apache returned in large numbers. A few spoke quietly about leaving for safer ground. The rancher listened without judgment. He could not promise safety, only honesty. One morning, just as the sun climbed above the horizon, dust appeared again in the distance. This time, it was not a wide line of riders but a smaller group, moving slowly and openly. The rancher felt his chest tighten, but he did not turn away. He walked forward to meet them alone. The Apache chief rode at the front. His posture was calm, his expression unreadable. Behind him rode several men, and among them, at a respectful distance, rode a young woman. She sat tall in her saddle, her eyes forward, her presence quiet but unmistakable. The rancher did not yet know her role, but he felt that she mattered. The riders stopped where they had before. The chief dismounted, placing his feet on the ground with deliberate care. The rancher followed, standing across from him. The air between them felt heavy but not hostile. It was filled with expectation. The chief spoke first. He said the debt had been discussed among his people. The life saved was not only the young man's, but the honor of the family and the tribe. Among the Apache, such a debt demanded a response that would last beyond words. The rancher nodded, though his heart beat faster. He said again that he had not acted for reward. He asked only that peace remain between them. The chief listened, then lifted his hand, signaling for the others to move. From behind a low rise, cattle were driven forward, not a handful, not a small herd. The rancher watched in disbelief as animal after animal came into view. Strong backs, healthy coats, steady steps. He began to count without meaning to, 100, 200, more still. When the count reached 400, the chief raised his hand again and the cattle were brought to a halt. The rancher felt dizzy. This was not just wealth. This was a fortune that could change a man's life forever. The chief spoke clearly. These cattle were to be given to the rancher, not as payment but as acknowledgement. The land had provided, and now balance was being restored. The rancher tried to speak, to refuse or at least lessen the gift, but the chief's gaze held him still. Then the chief turned slightly and gestured toward the young woman who had ridden with them. She dismounted and stepped forward. She moved with quiet strength, her expression calm, her eyes observant. She did not look afraid. She did not look proud. She looked prepared. The chief announced the second part of his decision. To seal the bond between them, the rancher would take his daughter as his wife. The words fell into the silence like stones into water. The rancher's breath caught, his thoughts scattered. He had expected many things, loss, gain, even conflict, but not this. Marriage was not a simple agreement. It was a joining of lives, of futures, of worlds that had long stood apart. The rancher looked at the young woman, then back at the chief. He struggled to find his voice. He said he was honored, but this was not something he could accept lightly. He spoke of difference in customs, in language, in ways of living. He did not want to bring dishonor or harm. The chief listened without offense. He said that his daughter understood the weight of the choice. She had been raised knowing her role as a bridge, not a prize. This marriage was not meant to erase differences, but to respect them. It was meant to turn a single act of mercy into lasting peace. The young woman spoke then, her voice steady. She said she did not fear change. She said she believed that a man who saved a stranger without asking his name would not treat a wife with cruelty. Her words were simple, but they carried strength. The rancher felt the ground shift beneath him. He realized that refusing could be seen not as humility but as rejection. It could turn gratitude into insult, peace into distance. Accepting, however, meant stepping into a life he had never imagined. He asked for time, not to delay but to consider with honesty. The chief agreed. He said the rancher would visit their camp, learn their ways, and speak again when his heart was clear. This was not a demand made in anger, but an offer made with purpose. The cattle were left under the care of the rancher's workers, who stood watching in stunned silence. The Apache riders turned and rode away once more, leaving behind dust, questions, and a future that felt suddenly very close. That evening the rancher walked among the cattle alone. He ran his hand along their backs, feeling their warmth, their strength. Each animal represented trust placed in him, not by chance but by choice. The weight of it pressed down on him, heavier than any burden he had carried before. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, it was filled with restless dreams, wide plains crossing paths, voices calling from opposite directions. He woke before dawn, his mind still crowded. In the days that followed, preparations were made. The rancher traveled with a small group to the Apache camp, moving carefully, respectfully. He observed their life, the order, the discipline, the quiet respect shown to elders and children alike. He saw the young man he had saved moving easily among his people, his strength returned, his eyes bright with life. He also saw the chief's daughter in her own world. She was attentive, capable, and deeply connected to her people. She spoke little to the rancher, but when she did, it was with clarity and calm. There was no illusion between them, no false promise, only honesty. As days passed, fear slowly gave way to understanding. The rancher began to see that this offer was not about ownership or control. It was about responsibility. To accept meant to carry two worlds on his shoulders and to walk carefully so neither fell. When the time came to speak again, the rancher stood before the chief with a steady heart. He said he would accept, not because of cattle and not because of pressure, but because he believed that peace was worth the risk. He believed that a life saved had opened a door, and walking through it was now his duty. The chief nodded, satisfied. The bond was set in motion. As the rancher returned to his land, he knew that nothing would ever be simple again. Wealth had come, yes, but more importantly, meaning had arrived with it. The roar of the chief's decision still echoed in his mind, not as a threat, but as a turning point. What began with mercy beside a dry creek had grown into something vast, and the rancher understood now that the plains did not just remember violence. They remembered courage too. The days leading to the marriage moved at a careful pace, neither rushed nor slow. Everything was done with intention. The rancher felt as if he were walking on ground that could shift if he stepped without thought. He kept his voice calm, his actions steady, and his mind open. This was no longer just about him. It was about trust that had been offered and needed to be honored. The first challenge was learning how to live between two ways of life without disrespecting either. At the ranch, his days had always followed a simple rhythm: sunrise, work, rest, repeat. In the Apache camp, time moved differently. Work was shared, stories were valued, and decisions were rarely made alone. The rancher listened more than he spoke. He watched how elders were treated, how children were taught, and how even silence carried meaning. The chief's daughter stayed near her people during this time, preparing in her own way. She did not cling to him, nor did she avoid him. When they spoke, it was usually about simple things, whether land, animals, daily tasks. Yet beneath those simple words was a quiet effort to understand each other without forcing closeness too soon. When she came to the ranch for the first time, it was with a small group, not for protection but for support. The rancher showed her the land, the cattle, the house he had built with his own hands. He did not exaggerate or hide the hardships. He wanted her to know exactly what life here would demand. She asked thoughtful questions. How far was the nearest neighbor? What happened during long winters? How did he handle sickness or loss? Her questions were not fearful, they were practical. He respected that. The workers watched her carefully at first, unsure how to behave. The rancher made his expectations clear. She was to be treated with respect, not curiosity or distance. Over time, the tension eased. She helped with small tasks, learned names, and offered quiet smiles that carried more meaning than many words. The marriage ceremony itself was not a single moment, but a series of shared actions. Some followed Apache custom, others reflected the rancher's way of life. There was no attempt to erase difference. Instead, each step acknowledged it. When the day came, the land seemed to pause again as it had before. The sky was clear, the wind gentle. Elders from the Apache camp stood alongside the rancher's people. There was no crowd, no celebration meant to impress, only witnesses meant to remember. The chief spoke first, his voice steady. He spoke of balance, of how one act of mercy had grown into responsibility. He spoke of his daughter not as something given away, but as someone choosing her own path. Then the rancher spoke, his words simple and honest. He promised not perfection but effort, not dominance but partnership. When they stood together, side by side, the rancher felt the weight of the moment settle into his bones. This was not the end of a journey. It was the beginning of one that would test them both. Life after the marriage was not easy, and neither of them expected it to be. The first weeks were filled with small misunderstandings. A gesture meant kindly could be taken the wrong way. Silence could feel like distance. The rancher had to unlearn habits he had carried for years. His wife had to adapt to a place where her language was not spoken, and her customs were not always understood. There were moments of frustration. Moments when each wondered if the other truly understood what had been given up. But there was also patience. When tension rose, they chose to speak plainly instead of letting silence harden into resentment. The rancher learned that strength did not always mean standing firm. Sometimes it meant stepping back and listening. His wife learned that independence could exist alongside shared responsibility. Slowly, trust grew, not through grand gestures but through daily choices. The land tested them too. A dry spell threatened the cattle. A storm damaged part of the barn. Each challenge forced them to work together, blending knowledge from both worlds. She offered insight on reading weather signs he had overlooked. He shared methods of protecting livestock he had learned through years of trial and error. Nearby settlers watched from a distance. Some were suspicious, others curious. A few were openly critical. The rancher did not argue with them. He let time speak. When trade continued without conflict, when no violence followed, fear began to lose its hold. Members of the Apache community visited the ranch more often, not as watchers but as guests. They brought news, shared food, and helped when needed. The ranch slowly became a place where paths crossed instead of colliding. At night, when the land grew quiet, the rancher and his wife would sit outside and talk. She told him stories of her childhood, of lessons taught through songs and shared memory. He spoke of the years he spent alone on the plains, learning to rely on the land and himself. In those moments, they were not symbols or bridges. They were simply two people learning to share a life. There were still moments of doubt. The rancher sometimes wondered if he had accepted too much responsibility. His wife sometimes felt the ache of distance from her people. When those moments came, they did not pretend they did not exist. They faced them together openly. One evening, as the sun set low and the cattle moved quietly across the field, the rancher realized something had changed inside him. The land no longer felt like something he owned. It felt like something he shared, not just with his wife but with a future shaped by cooperation rather than fear. The chief visited again some weeks later. He observed quietly, said little, and watched closely. When he finally spoke, his words were simple. He said balance was holding. That was all. To him, it meant everything. As he rode away, the rancher felt a deep sense of resolve. The hardest work was not behind them. It was ahead, but it was work worth doing. The plain stretched wide as ever, unchanged in shape but altered in meaning. Where once there had been lines drawn by fear, there were now paths formed by choice. The rancher knew that peace was not a gift given once and forgotten. It was something that had to be lived every day. And so, with patience, effort, and steady hearts, they continued, knowing that the true test of the bond they had formed would be measured not by words spoken, but by the life they built together. Time moved forward as it always did, carrying change quietly rather than all at once. Seasons passed over the plains, marking the years with rain and drought, growth and loss. The ranch did not become famous, but it became known. Known as a place where trouble did not linger, where words were honored, and where people were judged by their actions rather than their fears. The rancher and his wife settled into a rhythm shaped by patience. Mornings began early. Some days they worked side by side, other days apart, each trusting the other to carry their share. They learned when to speak and when silence was enough. Their life together was not a story told loudly, but one built carefully, piece by piece. The cattle flourished. The herd grew stronger with careful tending and shared knowledge. The rancher noticed that the land responded differently now. Not magically, but practically. With more hands willing to help, with better understanding of weather and grazing, fewer mistakes were made. Loss still came, but it did not feel lonely anymore. Neighbors slowly changed as well. At first, they watched from a distance, expecting conflict that never arrived. Then they began to trade again, cautiously at first, then more freely. Some asked questions they had once been afraid to voice. Others simply observed and learned. The rancher did not lecture or defend his choices. He worked, paid his debts, kept his fences strong and his words stronger. Over time, even those who disagreed could not deny what they saw. Peace, when real, speaks for itself. The Apache community remained connected to the ranch, not through constant presence but through steady respect. Messengers came and went. Help was offered when needed, not demanded. The bond that had once seemed fragile grew solid through consistency rather than force. The chief aged, as all men do. When he visited, it was less often now, but his eyes still missed nothing. He watched the ranchers' children grow, children who learned both worlds naturally, without confusion or fear. They understood that identity was not something divided, but something expanded. Those children became living proof that the choice made years earlier by a dry creek had not been a mistake. They moved easily between people, languages, and customs. They listened well. They asked thoughtful questions. They carried the quiet strength of those who knew where they came from and where they stood. There were still hard years. A harsh winter tested supplies. A sickness swept through cattle in nearby lands. Loss touched the ranch as it touches every life. But hardship no longer turned neighbors against each other. Instead, it pulled them closer, teaching them that survival was rarely a solo effort. One evening, long after the hardest days had passed, the rancher sat alone outside, watching the sunset. The land looked much the same as it always had, wide, open, indifferent to human plans. Yet he felt no smallness in its presence anymore. He felt belonging. He thought back to that moment years ago when he had stood by the creek bed, uncertain and afraid. He remembered how close he had come to riding away. The thought sent a quiet chill through him, not because of what he might have lost in wealth or peace, but because of the man he would have become if he had chosen fear instead. His wife joined him, sitting without speaking at first. They had learned that some moments did not need words. When she did speak, she asked him if he ever regretted that day. He considered the question carefully. Then he answered honestly, "No, not even once." The plains darkened as night settled in. Stars appeared one by one just as they had on countless nights before. Somewhere in the distance, cattle shifted, settling for rest. The sound was steady, reassuring. Years later, long after the rancher's hands had grown slower and his hair gray, people still spoke of the turning point that changed the land. Not as a legend filled with noise and exaggeration, but as a quiet truth passed down carefully. A man chose mercy. Another people chose honor, and between them something lasting was built. The ranch did not erase history. It did not pretend pain had never existed. Instead, it showed that history could continue without repeating its worst chapters. That courage did not always arrive with weapons or force. Sometimes it arrived as a simple decision made when no one was watching. When the rancher finally passed, he was buried on the land he had worked all his life. Not far away, members of both communities stood together, not divided by fear or suspicion, but united by respect. There were no grand speeches. None were needed. The land remained as it always would. Grass grew, wind moved, seasons turned. But the choices made upon it had left a mark deeper than any fence or trail. And so the story endured, not because of wealth gained or power held, but because one act of mercy proved strong enough to echo across generations, reminding those who came after that peace is not found by avoiding risk, but by choosing humanity when it matters most.